The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song, a sound Margaret Walsh had learned to hear as a kind of white noise, the sonic equivalent of disappearing. She moved through the hallway of Cedar Creek Medical's third floor with the careful invisibility of a woman who had spent 52 years learning to occupy no space at all. Her scrubs were navy blue, wrinkled at the hem, the uniform of someone who didn't bother with the iron anymore. 3 months working the night shift. 3 months of moving between rooms like a ghost in rubber-soled shoes, noting everything, saying nothing. The rain outside the corridor windows hammered against the glass like 1,000 impatient fingers. The patient charts stacked on the supply cart at the nurse's station seemed to breathe their own weight. Margaret pulled the first one, room 407, post-op day 3, recovering from routine abdominal surgery. She opened the file, and there it was again, the same careful notation she'd been documenting for weeks. The surgeon's billable hours listed twice. The anesthesia line itemized separately for procedures that had never happened. The radiographer's time logged for imaging studies that existed only in Dr. Caldwell's imagination. Her hands didn't shake as she read it. Her pulse didn't quicken. She had learned, in 18 years and 4 months of wearing a Navy uniform, that the body only betrayed you if you let it. She had learned this in Tikrit. The memory tried to surface, the smell of diesel fuel and copper, the weight of a man's arm around her shoulders as she dragged him toward the medevac, the sound of the Black Hawk's rotors drowning out everything including her own breath. She pushed it back down. Not now. Not here. Here, Margaret Walsh was just a quiet older nurse who took the shifts nobody wanted and never complained about the pay. Here, she was invisible. Her locker was in the basement, past the laundry facilities where the machines tumbled white sheets in endless cycles, past the storage room where boxes of expired medications gathered dust. She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking with that particular hospital sound, the sound of equipment that never got maintenance because nobody important enough noticed it. Inside, beneath her 2 spare sets of scrubs and her collection of black compression socks, sat the pair of combat boots. They were tan leather, cracked at the heel, caked with a reddish dust that was part dirt and part something else. The dust of Tikrit. The dust of a place she had volunteered to forget. These boots had walked through a burning forward operating base. They had stood in a surgical tent while a Marine medic held a tourniquet on a femoral artery and whispered a prayer. They had carried her across a runway toward a Sikorsky UH-60M helicopter while she held 3 dying men, one in each arm and one across her shoulders like a human bridge between life and whatever came after. The boots had sand in the laces that would never fully come out. She touched them once with the tip of her finger, the way other women touched photographs of their children. Then she closed the locker and climbed back upstairs to the night shift that was waiting for her like a patient waiting for anesthesia to finally take hold. Dr. Caldwell was at the nurse's station when she emerged from the stairwell. She recognized him by his voice before she saw him, that particular tenor of a man who had never been told no, who had learned early that money and a white coat could accomplish almost anything. He was on the phone, something about club memberships and weekend properties, his laugh carrying that particular resonance of someone laughing at his own jokes. The other nurses at the station, there were 3 of them tonight, looked away when Margaret approached. They had learned to do this over 3 months. They had learned that proximity to her meant proximity to whatever made Dr. Caldwell smile like a predator. She was reaching for the patient charts when he appeared beside her, suddenly, the way certain men always did. His cologne arrived first, something that cost more per ounce than gasoline, something that tried very hard to smell expensive instead of just smell like money. He held a chart in his right hand. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. The chart fell at her feet. She watched it fall, watched the pages scatter across the linoleum floor like white leaves. The room didn't go silent, the hospital never went truly silent. There was always the ambient hum of machines and the distant code calls and the ventilators wheeling their patients toward morning, but something shifted in the acoustic space. The other nurses became very focused on their computers. Margaret's jaw clenched once. The muscle at her temple tightened, pulling the skin taut for just a moment. Her hands, as she lowered herself to her knees, remained perfectly steady. She had worn a uniform that meant something once. She had held people together with her hands, literally held them, fingers pressed against wounds, applying pressure, applying knowledge, applying the kind of force that either saved a life or confirmed it was already gone. Those hands did not tremble. She gathered the pages. Some were charting notes. Others appeared to be billing summaries, the kind that had drawn her to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place. She noticed, as she collected them, that room for 07 appeared twice. The Marine General's room. Routine post-op. 3 days into recovery from an appendectomy that, if performed at any legitimate facility, would have cost approximately $4,000. This version, the Caldwell version, had cost the Veterans Administration something closer to $5,320. The difference wasn't incompetence. Incompetence was messier. This was calculation. "Thank you, sweetheart," Dr. Caldwell said as she stood, the chart now tucked under her arm. "I like a nurse who knows her place." She didn't respond. Her silence was a discipline, the same discipline that had carried her through flight school, through combat medic training, through the decision to walk away from a career that meant everything and take a job at a hospital in Houston under a name that wasn't quite hers, chasing a man who had figured out how to steal from the system meant to heal the very soldiers he was defrauding. The next 3 hours passed the way hospital hours always pass when nothing catastrophic is happening, a strange combination of tedium and hypervigilance. She checked on the post-op patients. She drew blood samples from room 401, a man recovering from hip replacement, his veins difficult, his patience thin. She found the collapsed vein on her second attempt and slid the needle through the skin with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory and genuine prayer. The small sucking sound of blood filling the tube made sense to her in a way that nothing else in her life did anymore. Room 407 was quiet when she passed it. The Marine General was asleep, his face holding that particular expression of rest that suggests someone is finally safe enough to exhale. She had been told his name in the briefing, had been shown his photograph, had been told that his medical file was essential to the larger investigation. She had not been told why his particular case mattered, which meant it mattered more than she could calculate. The federal investigator who had recruited her, a woman named Agent Clayton who wore her authority like a second spine, had simply said, "He's one of ours. Protect him." The file on the cart beside his bed showed the same patterns. The inflated hours. The phantom procedures. The carefully constructed fiction of a medical record that looked real enough to fool the billing clerks at the VA regional office in Dallas. She took a photograph of 2 pages with her phone, a burner phone that no one at Cedar Creek Medical knew existed, and filed it mentally in the growing archive of evidence that would eventually have to mean something. By the time her shift ended at 6 in the morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones like sediment. She had been awake for 22 hours. Her shoulders ached in that particular way that meant the old injury from Tikrit, a piece of shrapnel that had lodged near her scapula before a field surgeon extracted it, was reminding her that weather patterns changed and memories lived in the body long after the mind wanted to release them. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before starting the engine. The sun was rising somewhere above Houston, turning the sky that particular shade of copper that comes before heat. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and let the weight of 3 months, the silence, the documentation, the careful distance she maintained from everyone, settle across her shoulders like a coat made of iron. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the phone call that came through at 7:17 a.m. as she was finally pulling out of the parking structure. Agent Clayton's voice on the other end, calm and controlled, saying the words that would begin the unraveling of everything Margaret had constructed. "We have a situation. An Army Ranger came in through the ER last night. Hemorrhage control surgery. The Marine General donated blood. We need to know if Caldwell interfered with the transfusion protocols." Margaret pulled over on the shoulder of the access road leading away from Cedar Creek Medical. Beyond the guardrail, the city stretched toward the horizon like a patient waiting for a diagnosis it already knew would be bad. "Is the Ranger alive?" Margaret asked. "For now," Clayton said. "But if Caldwell found out who the general is, who the general's son is?" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Margaret understood, in that moment, that the investigation she had been conducting for 3 months, the careful paper trail she had been building, the invisible work of a woman learning to occupy no space at all of it was about to collide with something larger and messier and infinitely more dangerous than she had anticipated. She started the engine. The car hummed to life. Behind her, the sun continued rising over Houston, indifferent and relentless. The car hummed to life, and Margaret pulled out of Cedar Creek Medical's parking garage into the Houston heat, her hand steady on the steering wheel even as exhaustion pulled at her shoulders. 3 months undercover. 90 days of night shifts, meticulous charting, and careful questions about billing codes that nobody wanted asked. The evidence was building, scattered across encrypted files, hidden in her locker beneath the worn combat boots she'd carried out of Ticrat 8 years ago. But Dr. Caldwell was beginning to notice her. Not her competence. Not yet. Just her presence. The way she documented everything. The way she asked why a routine appendectomy required 3 separate facility charges when the medical record showed only 1 procedure. He'd smiled at her that morning, the smile of a man who had just recognized a problem that needed solving. She made it home, a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions and rent was paid in cash. The bed was unmade. The refrigerator held only water and protein powder. This was not a life. This was an assignment. She set her phone on the nightstand, the classified Pentagon line buried 3 layers deep in encrypted apps, and lay in the darkness, running through the numbers again. Caldwell's network had built $847,000 in fraudulent charges over 16 months, targeting veteran patients who were too medicated or too trusting to question the paperwork. The Marine General in room 407 had been billed for 17 procedures he never received. Her job was to document it. Protect him. Keep her cover intact until the federal prosecutors had enough to move. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep that would not come. Morning arrived like a strike. Margaret showered, dressed in the same generic scrubs every other nurse wore, and drove back to Cedar Creek Medical as the sun climbed over the concrete sprawl of Houston. The parking lot was already crowded, staff arriving for day shift, patients being wheeled through the automatic doors, the controlled chaos of a hospital that never stopped running. She parked in the back, locked the car, and walked through the employee entrance at 6:24 a.m., 17 minutes before her shift began. This was routine. This was safe. This was the moment Dr. Caldwell was waiting for. He stood in the hallway outside the surgical unit, speaking with 2 residents in the clipped, authoritative tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He saw her approach and his smile broadened, not kindness. Recognition. He excused himself from the residents and stepped directly into her path, his posture casual but calculated, the way a predator stands when it has already identified the weakest prey. Margaret, he said, using her first name in that particular way that made it sound like a diminishment. I have an assignment for you today. The bedpan station needs attention. It's been backing up. I think a nurse with your experience would be well suited to basic sanitation tasks. He gestured vaguely toward the surgical ward, where the most junior nurses handled the positions he was describing. The residents watched from 10 feet away. 3 other staff members passed in the corridor. Every eye in the hallway knew what was happening. You can handle that, yes? Margaret met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Her jaw tightened once, a single muscle contraction that took 0.3 of a second. Then she nodded. Yes, doctor, she said, her voice flat and even as still water. She did not apologize for her competence. She did not explain that she had managed a combat surgical team in a burning building. She simply accepted the assignment and moved past him toward the supply closet where the bedpans were kept. Behind her, Caldwell turned back to the residents, speaking in a lower voice that was meant to carry. Some nurses peak early. After a certain age, they're really only suited to support tasks. One resident laughed. It was the sound of a man who did not know he was watching a master class in patience. The morning moved forward with the relentless momentum of institutional routine. Margaret changed bedpans. She emptied catheters. She stripped soiled linens and replaced them with clean ones, her movements economical and precise, every gesture carrying the efficiency of someone who had done far worse under far more severe pressure. A patient, a woman recovering from a hysterectomy, asked Margaret's name. "Margaret," she answered. The woman thanked her. Margaret did not respond except to adjust the fall line and check the dressing without being asked. Caldwell passed twice. Both times he commented loudly about how grateful he was that the basic care duties were finally being handled properly. Both times Margaret continued her work without acknowledgement. By 11:56 a.m., the surgical unit had settled into the rhythm of post-lunch quiet. Most patients were resting. Most doctors were eating. The nurses' station was occupied by only 2 staff members, both far enough away that they could not hear a quiet conversation. This was when Caldwell chose to strike the second blow. He found Margaret at the beverage station in the break room, where she had taken exactly 17 minutes for a lunch she had brought from home, a protein bar and black coffee. The break room was crowded, 8 nurses, 3 residents, a respiratory therapist, and 2 surgical techs sitting at tables scattered across the space like islands. Every one of them was watching their phones or their food, but Caldwell moved as if the audience was irrelevant, because in his mind it was not. The audience was the entire point. He approached her table directly, his hand already raised. "Margaret, I wanted to make an announcement," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the entire room. The conversations around him died. The room did not go silent. Silence is something that happens gradually. This was different. This was a predator's presence causing the air to change. Margaret set down her coffee cup. "I'm betting that our new team member will quit within 1 week. Who wants in on the action?" He grinned, a thing that showed too many teeth. "Say, $50. He reached for her tray, his movements casual, as if he had already decided the outcome. His hand struck the edge of the plate. The lunch tray was plastic, the cheapest kind that hospital cafeterias used. It had no resistance. It flew from the edge of the table in an arc that scattered salad across the white tile floor, sent the coffee cup spinning so that it spilled across 7 feet of surface like a brown accusation. The room held its breath. Margaret's hands did not tremble. She did not flush. She did not freeze in the way that fear freezes people. Instead, she simply looked at the mess on the floor, then at Dr. Caldwell, then at the rest of the room, a visual acknowledgement that every person present had just witnessed exactly what he wanted them to see. "Oops," Caldwell said, that wolf smile widening. "Better clean that up, sweetheart. Wouldn't want anyone slipping." He turned and walked back toward the hallway, already engaged in conversation with one of the residents about a patient's post-operative labs, as if he had already forgotten the incident. As if it had been inconsequential. Margaret knelt on the tile floor. She did not move quickly. She did not move slowly. She moved with the deliberate, mechanical precision of someone executing a plan that had already been decided. She gathered the salad scattered across the tile. She wiped up the coffee with paper towels, the antiseptic smell of the hospital mixing with the sharp, bitter scent of spilled Arabica. One nurse looked away. Another picked up her phone. A resident, a young man named Harrison with a surgical rotation, started to stand as if to help. Margaret caught his eye with a single glance. "I've got it," she said. Her voice was not upset. It was not resigned. It was simply factual. Harrison sat back down. Margaret finished cleaning in silence, threw away the debris, returned to the sink to rinse her hands, and walked out of the break room without speaking to anyone or looking at anyone. She had 42 minutes remaining in her lunch break. She spent 31 of them sitting in her car in the parking garage, the engine off, her hands folded in her lap. What Caldwell did not understand, what he could not possibly understand, was that humiliation requires an audience to land. It requires someone who cares about the opinion of the crowd. Margaret had carried dying Marines across burning sand in Tikrit. She had held a man's intestines in place while calling for a medevac. She had spent 8 years learning that the people who survived were the people who did not depend on anyone else's approval to know who they were. The cafeteria incident, the bedpan assignment, the comments about age and competence, they fell against her with the force of rain against a tank. They made noise. They made a mess. But they did not penetrate. She returned to work at 12:23 p.m. and spent the remainder of her shift completing her assigned tasks, filling out patient charts, and documenting every single billing code that passed through the surgical unit. By the time the evening nurses arrived at 3 p.m., there was no visible evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Caldwell watched her move through the hallway, watched her check on a post-op patient in room 407, the Marine General, and for the first time, his expression shifted. Not to anger. To something closer to calculation. The social attacks had not worked. The humiliation had not broken her. She had absorbed it the way a submarine absorbs depth charges, with neither panic nor surrender. Which meant that Caldwell would need to deploy a different strategy entirely. He walked back to his office and closed the door. He pulled up the personnel database. 3 months. She had been there exactly 3 months. That was long enough to matter. That was long enough to have documentation of whatever it was she was digging into with those careful charts and those persistent questions about billing codes. Caldwell had built his practice on the principle that problems could be solved in 3 ways: they could be bought, they could be intimidated, or they could be removed. Margaret Walsh had just proven immune to intimidation. Which meant he would need to move to the third option. And he would need to do it before whatever she had discovered reached the attention of anyone who mattered. He reached for his phone and made the first of 3 calls that would reshape the entire trajectory of this quiet, unremarkable night nurse's carefully constructed cover. The intercom crackled at 2:47 in the morning. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. Level 1. Margaret was in room 407 changing the Marine Generals for bags when the overhead system seized the entire floor's attention, a voice like winter itself announcing that an Army Ranger had taken live-fire training rounds to the abdomen at Fort Hood, that he was 20 minutes out, that Cedar Creek Medical was the closest trauma center, that every available hand was needed in 30 seconds. She finished hanging the saline bag with the same precision she'd used to thread needles in Tikrit with mortar fire, walking up the street toward her position, then moved toward the stairwell without hurrying. Running meant panic. Running meant the younger staff would feel the pressure and make mistakes. She descended 3 flights in her soft-soled shoes, no clattering, no announcement, just presence, and found the surgical team already assembling in Trauma Bay for like parts of a machine clicking into place. Dr. Morrison, the trauma surgeon, was scrubbing at the sink. He glanced up, saw Margaret, and nodded. He didn't know her actual rank. He didn't know about Tikrit. He knew only that when Margaret appeared during a crisis, people lived. The surgical resident, a woman named Jen, maybe 26 years old, still building her confidence 1 procedure at a time, was pulling equipment from the crash cart. The anesthesiologist, Reeves, was checking his medications. 2 surgical nurses already gowned and gloved. The room smelled like antiseptic and cold stainless steel and the particular tension that comes when the patient rolling through those doors is only minutes away from either living or dying. Margaret scrubbed her hands and forearms with methodical efficiency. 16 years of protocol and training had taught her the sequence: fingernails first, hands, wrists, elbows, each motion deliberate and complete. But underneath that protocol lived 9 years of combat medicine, of working with supplies that didn't exist and time that ran backward. The Army Ranger's file was already on the monitor. 24 years old. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Multiple gunshot wounds to the lower abdomen and right flank. Blood loss estimated at 2 liters already. Type O negative. The rarest, most universal blood type, the kind that blood banks called their emergency reserve because it could be given to anyone when you didn't have time to type and cross-match. Cedar Creek's O negative was sitting in the cooler on the 3rd floor, and there were exactly 3 units left. She was gowned and gloved when Morrison made the announcement that stopped everyone's hands. The Ranger's blood type matched the Marine General in room 407. Rarer than O negative. Type B negative, a blood type found in maybe 0.5% of the population. Cedar Creek Medical didn't have it. The blood bank was calling other hospitals in the Houston area. Even if they found units elsewhere, the transfer would take time. Time the ranger didn't have. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the doors burst open and the paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a young man whose abdomen was covered in bandages already soaked through, whose skin had the grey-white pallor of someone losing blood faster than his heart could pump it. Morrison moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He called out vitals, BP 76/42, dropping, heart rate 138, conscious but struggling. The ranger's eyes found the faces above him, searching for something, reassurance, or just acknowledgement that he wasn't dying alone. Margaret stepped forward without waiting to be asked and helped transfer him to the surgical table. His hand was cold. Skin like wax. Shock. His body shutting down system by system, trying to preserve the core organs. Morrison was already calling for more blood, for the massive transfuser that could pump fluids into him faster than gravity alone, for every unit of O-negative in a 50-mile radius. And Margaret heard herself speak in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I'm O-negative." Reeves turned from his medication station. Chen's hands paused over the surgical field prep. Morrison was already opening the abdomen, working with the practice speed of someone who had done this procedure 1,000 times in his training and would probably do it 1,000 more before he retired. He didn't look up. The room had moved past social protocol into the mathematics of survival. "Type B negative," Morrison said. His voice was level. "We need B negative. You have a type." Margaret had already begun walking toward the supply station where the rapid-draw needles were kept. Her certification as a blood donor was somewhere in her medical file. She'd donated before coming to Houston, back when she still had a life that let her do such things. She knew her type down to the antigen level. She'd known it since basic training. She'd donated before the first deployment and the second and the third. She'd donated in the hospital at Landstuhl when they asked if anyone who'd been blood-typed could spare a unit for the wounded coming up from theater. She'd been type B negative her entire adult life. "B negative," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. She found the needle, the collection bag, the anticoagulant vial. "I can give 2 pints. Faster than waiting for a transfer." Morrison made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. He was opening the ranger's abdomen now, his hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who had trained on cadavers for 7 years and then on actual humans for 15 more. The internal bleeding was massive. Organs already damaged. The ranger was losing consciousness. His pressure was dropping past 70. The monitors beeped their mechanical warning, a sound like a bird calling to something very far away, getting more insistent. Margaret sat in the phlebotomy chair that someone wheeled over, she didn't see who, and rolled up her sleeve. The needle went in easy. Her veins were good. Years of running and combat training and the kind of physical conditioning that came with military life had made her vascular system efficient. Blood began flowing into the bag. Gravity did the work. 110 milliliters per minute. Her donation running into a sterile line while the ranger's body was opened and examined and stitched back together on the table 20 feet away. She watched the bag fill. Watched her own blood drain. The sensation was strange, distant, for kind of lightness that started in her limbs and worked toward the center. She'd given blood before, but never like this. Never while someone she didn't know was dying because his own body couldn't keep him alive. The ranger's pressure dropped to 62/38. Morrison called for the massive transfuser. Someone was already hanging the first unit of O-negative. Reeves was pushing epinephrine in doses that made his voice crisp and fast. The first bag filled. Then the second. Margaret's hands had turned pale. The world had a slight shimmer to it. Someone was saying something about her blood pressure, but she wasn't listening. She was watching the monitors. Watching the ranger's O2 saturation climb from 64%. 67. 70. 72. The bag came off the needle. She was still sitting in the chair when the surgical nurse, Morrison's nurse, trained for 12 years, a woman named Garrett who had probably run this exact room 200 times before, appeared with the collection bag. Margaret's blood. Her cells. Her oxygen-carrying capacity, now somebody else's survival mechanism. Garrett moved the line directly to the massive transfuser, and Margaret watched it disappear into the rapid infusion pump. The ranger's pressure began to stabilize. 74/40. 76/42. The color in his face changed, very slightly, from the gray-white of exsanguination to something more alive. She stood up. Her legs were steady. Training had taught her that too, blood loss was data, not drama. Process the information. Adjust your movement. Continue the mission. She walked to the scrub station and washed her hands again, even though she'd already worn gloves. The water was cold. The antiseptic soap smelled like hospitals everywhere, like places where people tried to save lives that statistics said were already lost. Behind her, Morrison was calling numbers. Suction. Another unit of O negative. The ranger's intestines were damaged but repairable. His spleen was gone. His right kidney was probably gone too. But he was alive. His heart was beating without epinephrine now. His pressure was holding at 82/48. 84/50. Margaret dried her hands and moved back into the room. No one had asked her to return. She simply appeared when people were dying. Morrison glanced up once. He was working on the vascular repair now, using a technique that required absolute precision and the kind of focus that made everything else invisible. She stood by the anesthesia station next to Reeves and began anticipating the next line he would ask for. The next medication the ranger's body would need as blood volume returned and the nervous system began registering that it wasn't shutting down anymore. Reeves pulled a medication before he spoke. Margaret was already holding it. She had done this before, not in a hospital, but in a Humvee outside Tikrit with the smell of diesel and burning rubber and copper blood, with rounds hitting the armor plating like hail. The procedures were the same. The principle was always the same. Keep them alive long enough to reach treatment. Keep them alive long enough for their own body to catch up. The surgery took 3 hours. The ranger's abdomen was closed at 4:53 in the morning. His pressure was 108/62. His heart rate was 92 and regular. His oxygen saturation was 98%. He had taken 2 units of her blood and the massive transfuser had replaced the volume he'd lost with carefully calculated fluids and additional O negative from the rapid donor network, but the first 2 units had been the difference between a body that could support itself and a body shutting down into irreversible shock. She had given him that difference. She had given it freely. Morrison looked at her once as the ranger was being transferred to the ICU. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "We could have waited for the transfer." "No, you couldn't," Margaret said. Her voice was even. "For more minutes and he would have coded." Morrison nodded. He already knew. He'd been counting the same minutes she had. He turned back to the surgical field. Margaret pulled off her gloves and stepped back into the hallway. The clock on the wall said 5:02. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song. The ICU was already preparing a bed. She walked to the break room and sat down in one of the plastic chairs. Her head was swimming slightly. She'd given blood before, but never this much while standing for hours. Her body was telling her to hydrate. To rest. To sit down in a quiet place and let her hemoglobin levels recalibrate. She drank 3 cups of water from the dispenser. The room was empty. Just her and the hum of the hospital's overnight machinery, the sound of a place that never stopped trying to prevent death. By 6:30, she was back on her shift. The Marine General in room 407 was awake. His monitors showed stable vitals, his own blood pressure, his own oxygen saturation, his own heart rhythm now that the surgery was complete. She changed his 4 bags again. She checked his bandages. She did the work that no one celebrated and that everyone assumed was simple. He looked at her briefly as she worked, his eyes still clouded from anesthesia, his body still processing the trauma of being opened and repaired. He didn't know who had given blood to save someone else's life. He didn't know that a Master Chief Petty Officer had opened a vein for a stranger. She was just the night shift nurse. The quiet woman who appeared when needed and disappeared when the work was done. But Dr. Caldwell knew. By the time Margaret was charting the Ranger's post-operative vitals at 7:15 in the morning, Caldwell had already been called by someone on the surgical team, probably Reeves, probably thinking he was sharing a story of clinical competence. A nurse who'd given blood during an emergency procedure. A nurse who'd anticipated needs like she'd been trained at a level beyond Cedar Creek Medical. A nurse who'd opened her own vein for a patient she'd never met. Caldwell arrived at the hospital at 7:42 wearing a suit that cost more than Margaret made in a month, and she could feel his attention on her the moment he stepped onto the floor. He stood in the hallway outside the surgical unit, watching her work with the intensity of someone who had just realized that his problem was larger and more dangerous than he'd calculated. She had resources he hadn't known about. She had connections that ran deeper than any medical background check had uncovered. She had just demonstrated, in front of Morrison and Reeves and Chen and every nurse in that trauma bay, that she was capable of something far beyond the scope of a civilian hospital employee. He reached for his phone and made the first call at 7:47. Then the second at 7:52. Then the third at 8:04. Margaret was in room 407 when her own phone rang, an internal number she didn't recognize, a voice asking her to report to administration immediately. The voice was administrative. Neutral. But she already knew what was coming. Caldwell had moved past social attacks. He had moved past humiliation. He was now escalating to the kind of institutional sabotage that could end careers. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Room 407, post-op day 2. Margaret checked the 4-line running into the Marine General's arm, clear fluid, no discoloration, flow rate holding at 125 milliliters per hour. His vitals were stable. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate 62, strong and regular. She made a note on the chart and turned to change out the empty bag hanging from the aluminum pole. The general was sleeping, his chest rising and falling beneath the white hospital blanket. His son, the Army Ranger she'd given her blood to save, had left an hour ago, exhausted, limping back to his own recovery room 3 floors down. Margaret had watched the young man's face as he left his father's side, the color returning to his cheeks, the steadiness coming back to his hands. 2 pints of O-negative. That was all it had taken. Her blood in his veins now, cells splitting and regenerating, keeping him alive while his body rebuilt what the live fire accident had taken. She hung the fresh bag, checking the line for air bubbles. Hospitals were temples of precision. Every milliliter counted. Every second mattered. She'd learned that truth in Tikrit, where precision meant the difference between a Marine walking out of a hospital or being carried out in a flag-draped case. The general's eyes opened. "How are you feeling, sir?" Margaret's voice was soft, professional. Just another nurse checking on another patient. Like someone opened my ribs. His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. But alive. That's something. She smiled, brief and efficient. "Your numbers are excellent. Doctor should clear you for light walking tomorrow." She was turning to leave when she heard it, a sound like a record player skipping. The heart monitor's rhythm fractured. One steady beep. Then another. Then a pause that stretched too long. Then nothing. No. The general's body went rigid. His back arched off the mattress. Margaret spun back. The monitor showed what she already knew, ventricular fibrillation. His heart wasn't pumping. It was quivering. Dying. She hit the code button. The alarm that erupted was a shriek, high and urgent, cutting through the hospital's usual hum like a siren through fog. Red lights flashed above the doorframe. Margaret was already moving, already pulling the crash cart closer, her hand steady as a surgical laser despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The on-call surgeon was 20 minutes away. She knew this because she'd seen his schedule that morning. 20 minutes. The general had maybe 4. 2 nurses burst through the door, younger women, both frozen for the half-second it took their brains to process what the monitor was showing. Margaret didn't wait for them to move. She stripped his gown away, exposing his chest. The surgical closure was still fresh, stitches dark against pale skin. He'd been opened 24 hours ago. Now she was going to open him again. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, push-pull setup. Her voice was flat, authoritative. Not a request. A command. One of the nurses blinked. The surgeon is 20 minutes out. This patient has 4. Margaret's hands were already moving, already finding the exact space between his ribs where the original surgical team had worked. 4th intercostal space, left side. She'd seen the operative report. She knew exactly where his heart was. She reached for the surgical kit one of the nurses finally, had the presence of mind to grab. Scalpel. 1 incision, deep and decisive, muscle memory taking over. The blade went through skin, through fascia, through the intercostal muscles with a precision that came from 100 training scenarios and 7 combat tours. The smell of antiseptic and exposed tissue filled the room. The sound of the heart monitor was still flatlined, a long, unwavering tone that meant death was counting down on its fingers. Margaret's hands moved inside the chest cavity now, gentle but firm, finding the heart. It was a useless thing in her palms, quivering instead of pumping. Dead weight. She began direct cardiac massage, her fingers squeezing the ventricles, forcing blood through chambers that had forgotten how to work. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Her rhythm was perfect because there was no other option. Push 1 milligram epi, for push, she said. One of the nurses was crying now, but she was moving, pushing medication into the port. Now defibrillate. The pads went on. Margaret pulled her hands back. The general's body convulsed as the electrical current hit. She was back inside immediately, hands compressed, squeezing. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Blood was everywhere now, on her hands, on her scrubs, on the white sheets that had been clean 5 minutes ago. This was what she remembered from Tikrit. This exact red. This exact smell. This exact weight of another person's life balanced on the razor edge between breathing and gone. 30 seconds had passed. Then 45. Then a full minute. Push another round of epi, she said. The younger nurses weren't crying anymore. They'd gone silent. Stunned. Watching a night shift nurse crack open a Marine general's chest and perform a procedure that no nursing protocol anywhere on Earth authorized her to perform. Muscle memory. That's what they would call it later, if they ever got asked. That's what it looked like when someone's hands knew what to do because those hands had done it before. Not in a hospital. Not with proper supervision. But on a burning street in Tikrit with incoming fire and a Marine whose only chance was the woman kneeling beside him. 2 minutes. Margaret's arms were burning now, her shoulders screaming, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The general had his son who had his general. Chain of command going backward, obligation flowing upstream. She squeezed. The monitor beeped. Then again. Then a rhythm started, slow at first, then steadying. Sinus rhythm. The general's own heart, remembering how to work. Margaret didn't stop the massage until the rhythm held for 30 seconds. Only then did she pull her hands back, step away, breathe. The residents burst through the door, the attending surgeon right behind them. They took over in that smooth transition only experienced medical teams could perform. Rapid assessment. Continued chest compressions from someone who wasn't covered in blood. Ice packs on the general's groin to slow his metabolism, preserve his brain while they got him upstairs to ICU. 1,000 hands moving in orchestrated precision. Margaret stepped back. Her scrubs were soaked. Blood had seeped into her hair, crusted the back of her neck. She could smell it, copper and iron, the smell of survival, the smell of Tikrit. She peeled off her gloves and walked out of the room as they wheeled him toward the elevator. The ICU waiting area was quiet. Too quiet. She found a corner where nobody would look, the supply room next to the ventilator station, and let the adrenaline crash wash through her like a wave. Her hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From the aftermath. She'd learned long ago that the trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the moment her body finally released what her mind had locked down. She leaned against the cool tile wall and waited for the shaking to stop. It took 40 minutes. Then she walked upstairs to the ICU to check on him. The general was unconscious, sedated, his new chest incision wrapped and monitored. Machines surrounded him, each one measuring some vital component of his continued existence. Margaret stood in the doorway, still in her bloody scrubs, and watched the rhythm on the monitor. Strong. Steady. Alive. You're out of protocol. Margaret turned. Dr. Caldwell stood behind her in the hallway, his face drained of color. His eyes moved from her face to her chest to her hands, all covered in blood. The blood of the Marine General. The blood of Margaret's unauthorized intervention. The blood that proved she had performed a thoracotomy without physician supervision, without hospital protocol, without any legal right to lay hands on a patient in the way she had. He smiled. Very slowly. The smile of a man who had just watched his opponent make a catastrophic mistake. That, he said quietly, is going to cost you everything. The ICU bay doors hissed shut behind Margaret as she stepped into the corridor. Her scrubs were still damp with the general's blood. The fluorescent lights above her felt like an interrogation, clinical and merciless. She didn't see Dr. Caldwell watching from the nursing station 40 feet away, but she felt his presence the way a wolf feels a hunter drawing near. 1 hour later, he was on the phone in his private office. The tremor in his voice wasn't fear. It was fury. It was the sound of a man who'd just realized his carefully constructed empire had been built on sand. 3 calls, he said into the receiver. Make 3 calls. I don't care if they owe me or not. Tell them I'm calling in everything. The first call went to board member Hastings, a man who'd approved Caldwell's billing methodologies in exchange for consulting contracts worth $180,000 per year. Hastings listened to the proposal for exactly 47 seconds before he agreed. The second call reached Inspector Chen at the Texas Medical Board, the same Inspector Caldwell had fed leads to for 6 years on competitors and whistleblowers. Chen owed him. More importantly, Chen feared him. The third call was internal, to the hospital administrator's administrative assistant, a woman whose daughter Caldwell had personally recommended for a pediatric residency at Baylor. For people. For leverage points. For weapons loaded and aimed. The complaint was drafted by 8:15 p.m. Margaret Walsh, RN, had performed an unauthorized thoracotomy without physician supervision. She had utilized combat medical techniques inappropriate for a civilian hospital setting. She had endangered a Marine general's post-operative recovery by introducing unnecessary trauma. The language was precise, clinical, and utterly fabricated. Caldwell had watched through the observation window as Margaret cracked the general's chest, but he hadn't seen the moment the man's heart restarted under her hands. He'd only seen a weapon he could use. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the complaint reached the Texas Medical Board Nursing Division. Caldwell had friends there too. Within 90 minutes, Margaret received a formal notice of suspension, effective immediately. Her hospital credentials were deactivated. Her access badge no longer worked. The investigation would take weeks, the notice explained, but pending its outcome, she was prohibited from practicing nursing in any hospital setting in Harris County. The paper in her hands felt heavier than the patient she'd lifted from a burning vehicle in Tikrit 14 years ago. Caldwell's network spread wider. His IT contact pulled Margaret's employment records and began cross-referencing her background documentation. Military service dates that didn't quite align with her nursing school timeline. A social security number that had been flagged for unusual activity. A home address in Arlington that correlated with 3 other federal employees. The inconsistencies Margaret had spent months constructing, layers of false history designed to survive a surface investigation, suddenly looked like the elaborate fiction they were. One of the board members contacted the hospital administrator. Another reached out to a journalist contact at the Houston Chronicle. By noon, the story was being shaped: veteran nurse suspended after unauthorized procedure endangers patient. The narrative was crystalline and devastating. A decorated surgeon's complaint against an overqualified nurse who'd violated protocol. A military technique applied in a civilian setting. A Marine general whose recovery could be compromised by the trauma. The truth was being buried under the weight of a lie so well constructed that even Margaret could almost see it as reasonable. She sat in her car in the hospital parking garage on level 3B, engine dead, windows fogging with her breath. 2 hours passed. She didn't move. Her forehead was pressed against the steering wheel, a position she hadn't allowed herself to assume since the night before deployment to Iraq in 2009. The parking garage smelled like oil and despair and the faint trace of antifreeze. Around her, engine started and died. Tires squealed on concrete. Lifts moved forward. Hers had just stopped. She couldn't call her federal handler, Agent Reeves, without confirming Caldwell's suspicions that she was anything other than a nurse. Reeves would be monitored by now. Caldwell would be watching for that call, waiting for proof that Margaret was something other than what she claimed. To reach out for help was to admit the mission was compromised, which meant everything she'd documented, every hour of careful evidence gathering, would be contaminated. It would be suppressed. It would be worthless. The mission had been to document the fraud and protect the general until federal prosecutors had enough evidence to move. She'd succeeded on both counts. The evidence was bulletproof. The general was alive. And now she was expendable. Pain was data. That's what they'd taught her in combat medic school. Pain tells you what's broken. But this pain, the weight of 2 months of humiliation grinding against the weight of mission failure, of having played the long game perfectly only to have the game board overturned by a man who understood institutional leverage better than she'd given him credit for, this pain told her nothing except that she'd failed. She'd failed her orders. She'd failed the Marine general, whose recovery was now in question because of a fabricated complaint. She'd failed the veterans in that hospital who needed someone watching their charts, documenting the predators in white coats. She'd failed the young nurses like the one she'd seen accepting Caldwell's contempt as normal, as inevitable, as the price of working in a hospital run by a man who measured value in profit margins rather than lives saved. The combat boots sat on the floor of her locker at Cedar Creek Medical. She couldn't go back there. Her badge was dead. Her access was revoked. The investigation would find inconsistencies that couldn't be explained, contradictions that would spiral upward until someone in Washington started asking questions that couldn't be answered without compromising federal operations. She had perhaps 72 hours before the other military operatives she'd never met, the ones in Arlington who pulled surveillance and the ones in D.C. who controlled the narrative, decided that Margaret Walsh had become too exposed to keep alive as a federal asset. They would disappear her. Reassign her. Plant her in another hospital in another state, where she'd start over with a new false identity, a new cover story, a new layer of carefully constructed fiction. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Caldwell would walk free. He'd already made his moves. The board members would protect him. The state inspector would find insufficient evidence of intentional fraud. Caldwell would likely be cautioned about documentation procedures, maybe fined by the hospital, and then he'd simply move his operation to another institution or work out of private practice where oversight was even more lax. The $4.7 million in fraudulent billing he'd perpetrated would remain in the VA's budget as a mysterious loss. The veterans he'd overcharged, oversurged, and sometimes harmed with unnecessary procedures, they'd never know. They'd assume they received the care they needed because it was easier than imagining they'd been treated as profit centers. Margaret's breath fogged the windshield. The darkness of the parking garage felt like weight itself, like the concrete was pressing down from above. She thought about the Marine general waking up in his recovery room. She thought about the Army Ranger whose life she'd saved with her blood. She thought about the next shift of nurses who would walk into Cedar Creek Medical and see Caldwell moving through the corridors as if nothing had happened, as if power flowed upward through networks rather than through competence and honor. She pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel. The silence in the car was absolute. Complete. The kind of silence that comes not from absence of sound but from the presence of finality. This was the moment where the operation ended. This was where the undercover operative ceased to exist because her cover had been blown and her utility had been exhausted. But then her phone buzzed. Just once. A text message that made no sense in the moment, a single sentence from an unknown number, turn on the hospital television. Channel 7. Now. She didn't recognize the number. She didn't hesitate. Margaret started the engine and drove back toward Cedar Creek Medical. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.